Hello everyone, and welcome back to the designs of Devilmaycry. Today, we're talking about Devilmaycry 4, a game which, if you've seen my other video on it, I have some rather mixed feelings about, and I think that carries over pretty much equally to the designs. Now, I am aware that in a lot of places Devilmaycry 4 is kind of very obviously not finished, and the developers and storytellers and designers didn't really get to have their full vision come to fruition with it. However, I can't really go off of a vague idea of what they were trying to do. I can only really analyze what I have. And to be fair, it is a surprisingly mixed bag, with some genuinely really good and interesting designs in there, mixed in with a lot of designs. Anyway, moving along, let's establish the general ideas and themes of DMC4 before I get to analysing the designs. So, thematically, it's very close to Devilmaycry 1. It reiterates a lot of the same basic thematic ideas. There are humans, and there are demons. Demons manipulate and take advantage of human weakness, believing themselves superior because of their greater physical and magical power. However, that power lacks purpose, so it leads the demons to taking on chimeric and misshapen forms that lack any sense of cohesion, because they have no purpose other than the acquisition of greater power. The thing that separates humans and demons in this game is the capacity, the love, and the clarity and intent of purpose that love can bring. All of Sanctus's plans are undone because he fails to account for Nero's love for Kyrie. At least they would be if they didn't also fail to account for the big red guy. Now, it does have much better overt storytelling and iteration on these themes than Devilmaycry 1, but you will see the running problem that holds back its designs compared to that game. Okay, let's start with Nero. Nero is trapped, thematically, between Dante and Virgil, because both of those designs excel so hard at presenting the themes and ideas of the series and a contrast between each other. You have Dante dressed in his passionate red, representing the human heart and the ability to love and intent of purpose. You have Virgil with his cool blue coat, representing the more demonic end of the spectrum. Virgil constantly seeking ever greater levels of power because of the trauma they both endured when they were kids. It is a fundamentally extremely strong binary, and it works because everything in them both contrasts and reflects off of each other. Now, Nero is stuck here because he can't really play around with that without doing a lot of what either one of those designs was already doing. It does play around a little with colour. You've got a dark blue, almost black overcoat and a red shirt beneath, bringing together the two primary colours of Dante and Virgil, which is cool and all, but I don't really feel that reflects off of Nero's in-game personality. And that does reflect off of Nero's in-game personality to some degree. He does, after all, have the capacity for love and passion of Dante, and also the constant desire for power and improvement that Virgil has. Virgil's Devilbringer also does something clever by having the same colour combination but in the inverse, which instantly draws your attention to it as his most recognisable feature, as well as kind of hinting towards his lineage as Virgil's son with the focus on blue instead of red. But despite all this, I would say I think the design is kind of muted, almost, compared to Dante and Virgil, which is a bit disappointing considering Nero is arguably the most wild and uncontrolled protagonist we've had so far, and not much in his design really plays off of that, I find. The main aspect that does play with this kind of unrestrained wildness is his sword, the Red Queen, which is unquestionably the coolest thing about him. A sword that you rev up like a motorbike. I mean, yeah, that's always going to be cool, but also it represents his reckless nature and his tendency to fly off the handle. The double-barreled revolver is a cool little contrast with Dante, aiming to up the ante on its inherent silliness, as you go from having two relatively normal-looking guns to one weird revolver-looking thing. But I don't really think it's doing anything other than that. Nero's design used a lot of Dante's visual language, straps, zips, and buckles to convey a sense of restraint lying beneath the wildness, but cleverly has this neat little silly touch with the zip being undone at the bottom, lending a little bit of modern Final Fantasy goofy fashion that serves to both make him more fun visually and add a little bit of character building depth with the idea that he's still wild even if he looks restrained. There's something about him that refuses to conform to basic order. His devil trigger also bangs. I love the idea to essentially just have it be this giant stand that's behind him and imbues all of his swings with extra demonic power. I think if you had a meaningful conflict about reconciling those human and devil halves in this game, this devil trigger could have been used in a really cool way. This is overall what I'd call a flatly solid design. It uses the same design and colour language the series has made use of since the first game to communicate some aspects about his character, but somehow just feels lacking in flair for me. Beyond certain small touches, very little about this design tells me who this guy is or makes him feel visually distinct from Dante or Virgil, and like it's doing something different with the design philosophy of Devilmaycry, like how DMC3 Dante subverted the whole straps across the chest showing maturity thing by baring his chest and having only one strap keeping it in place. This design feels afraid to take risk, is what I think I'm trying to say here. It definitely doesn't help that both of his alt costumes are so much better. The purple one with the long flowing tassels gives him an actually unique shape among the DMC protagonists, as well as the idea of the primary colour, purple, being a fusion of Dante's red and Virgil's blue, which is, for me, a much more interesting way to express that balance. Also, the long flowing tassels communicating that constant sense of freedom that Nero aspires to. There's also his third, which goes a completely different direction and makes the Virgil connection much more explicit by essentially colouring him the same as Virgil, doing basically everything his base design does while giving him a more appealing central colour combination. Overall, I'd say it's around about a B tier design. It's a solid piece of design work, but it's really telling that it desperately feels like it's trying to break out of Dante's shadow and can't really do anything unique from him in a meaningful sense. Speaking of Dante, the wacky woohoo funny pizza man looks decent. This is a very solid, natural evolution of his DMC1 design. Along with making him visually a little older with a touch of stubble around his face, they scaled up his buckles and made them by far one of the most eye-catching pieces of this design, placing extra focus on his maturity, which seems to suggest a more mature teacher-like role in this game, but he's still the wild, wacky and goofy uncle, which is fine. I think everything in this design already works beautifully towards conveying that same sense of arrogance and passion which has always defined him, which makes this design kinda difficult to talk about as much. It's not really taking that many risks. His shirt changed from red to black to accent the gold of the buckles through stark contrast, further drawing you back to them and communicating that sense of underlying maturity. The sloped edges of his coat give him this smooth feel, as though anything you throw would slide right off of him. It reintroduces touches like the fingerless gloves to keep that sense of punk arrogance and move back away from DMC1's professional black gloves. And the change-ups in white and black in his design provide strong contrast with Nero. Passionate red on the outside, tempered by cold black on the inside, suggesting a maturer, more severe edge to Dante. Just an insane amount of competent design work here for something ostensibly so simple. It's a great design. His weapons continue to be really fun and goofy, all expressing that continuing theme of having more to them than meets the eye through transformations or weird gimmicks. His devil trigger, on the other hand, has always been a bit for me. I don't like it, and I think it could do something much more interesting than just being a kind of red devil guy. Like how Nero's does something interesting by being a stand, effectively accenting all of his attacks. It's an S tier design, brought down to A by disgusting footwear. Kyrie is here. God, I don't have that much to say about this one. So, remember when DMC3 did something super interesting by taking the idea of a holy maiden character with lady and subverting the fuck out of it to create a character whose holiness was their purity and intent of purpose compared to the emotionally clouded states of Dante and Virgil? Well, Kyrie is just that, but with no subversion going on, and she's kind of just a boilerplate holy maiden design. Long flowing white dress with a tad of gold and black accentation to add contrast, along with like a weird beige like outer blouse thing. I'm not sure on the word exactly. There's an echo of an interesting idea here with the starkly contrasting red hair, possibly hinting at a deep-set passion in her personality which isn't able to be expressed because she has like 5 lines. To be clear, this design isn't exactly bad, it does exactly what it sets out to do, demonstrating who Kyrie is as a character. It's just not interested in doing anything actively unique with any of those ideas either, which leads me to like a solid C tier overall. Sanctus is the main villain of Devilmaycry 4, and he has some pretty big shoes to fill, considering that Devilmaycry villains typically at least tend to have incredibly fun designs. Yes, even Arius. So, how well does he work? Yeah, he's pretty good. Better than I think I actually gave him credit for in my original video when I was talking about him. I think because I was so focused on other aspects again, I kind of got lost over how understatedly excellent his design is in terms of just being very solid character design. Mostly. Let's start by talking about the colour. His robes are dominated by 3 colours: white, robe, and red. White is generally used in this series to communicate purity. Purity of purpose and intent in Lady's case, and purity of character in Kyrie's case. Like Kyrie, the 3 main characters that dominate Sanctus' design are white, gold, and red. However, where Kyrie is majority white with a few accents of gold creeping in, Sanctus' design is dominated by gold and red, with white only creeping into a designated few areas. This design almost seems to evoke Mundus, with this shell of white over a core of gold and red symbolizing demonic passion, and Sanctus' ostentatious arrogance being symbolized by the gold. It gives him a regal look rather than being a humble servant of Sparta like he claims. It's a pretty fair takeaway from this design that he's dominated by arrogance, or at least attributes himself as something divine. It is somewhat an understated design compared to Dante, for instance, but one that absolutely works within the context of who this character is. Much like Arkham, he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, a deeply arrogant and avaricious person hiding under the guise of a meek servant. Like Arkham, small exaggerated touches within the design peek out and belie his true nature. There's the gold obviously, but also his giant of bucket headdress, capped with an angelic halo. Once again, repetition of that idea that he believes he's something divine, set apart from everything else, which his design naturally brings focus to through the silly nature of the hat it's mounted on. Your eyes are naturally drawn to that halo. Using silly, exaggerated aspects of character design like this to highlight important aspects of a character is a really fun design principle that's carried all the way through DMC thus far. Also, it's interesting to note tapers down to form a sword. Not only a nice piece of iconography, but more importantly, he intends to use this supposed divinity as a weapon. Sanctus is named after the Sanctus, a common Catholic prayer which is effectively a praise of God's absolute power. However, despite all of that absolute power, he's too cowardly to fight you head on, so he relies on these drones in your fights with him, which project a shield to guard him from your attacks, breaking into that common theme of Devilmaycry bosses relying on gimmicks to protect themselves. Many of his attacks are themed around using lightning or holy light to represent this biblical view he has of himself. However, one of the major problems that Sanctus has is that you have this amazing, really interesting and nuanced design backed up with not much characterization. I talked about this in my other review, but basically in an ideal world, the reveal of Sanctus having been evil the whole time could have used with a lot more build-up. As is, Sanctus doesn't really have that much characterization apart from being very basic evil Pope man, who doesn't really have a personal connection to any of the characters, sort of Nero and sort of Kyrie, but he doesn't really interact with them on a personal level. The reason why this doesn't work is that it makes him feel like he has no depth, he has no personal interaction with the story or characters. He just kind of appears, goes, I'm the evil Pope man, I'm going to destroy the world because I want to be king of the demons, and disappears once Dante and Nero beat him. The reason why this is kind of problematic is it gives him no scenes where he can kind of shine as an interesting villain, showing his view on the world, why he became this way, or even just getting a second to shine. In most scenes he's in, he's either outshined by Dante or outshined by Nero even, because he has no real stake in the story, he doesn't know who the fuck Nero is, he doesn't interact with Dante properly, he doesn't have any personal connection or stake to those two characters, because, yeah, he just fundamentally doesn't work in terms of explicit characterization, which is really sad, because he potentially could have been one of the coolest villains in the entire series. Evil Sanctus is certainly a design. His angelic halo moves up to his head to mimic a pair of demonic horns, and his hair spikes up to create this crown almost. The design in general becomes far more angular in comparison to his normal form, but something here just feels missing to me, and I can't quite put my finger on it. I think certain aspects work really well, like the area connecting the wings to the back being a pair of demonic horns, and the wings just being bright white closer to him but tapering off into a demonic red the further they go out. A lot of really cool touches, but the design feels quite busy without doing that much that I actually like. It feels like it's trailing in the footsteps of Arkham's Jester alter ego design, which beautifully characterized his true nature while linking it with his outward face, but missing that really clear contrast between the holy and the divine. Yeah, I think that design's kind of just a me thing more than anything. Generally, Evil Sanctus is very, very cool as well. It's an excellent answer to his normal design. While there are a lot of cool smaller things like that, I do feel like this design is just a little bit busy, without actually doing all that much. Like, yes, you have these small spots of really cool bits of symbolism where it's like, the halo is broken apart to reveal demonic horns, and you have all of these divine aspects being corrupted by demonic power. However, the rest of the design, the majority of it, just doesn't feel like it's doing that much. It feels like it's screaming at you, I am a demon, do you get it yet? Rather than doing anything more interesting and overall more cohesive. Like, it would be so much more interesting if he got an outwardly more angelic design like Credo or Agnus did. Instead, he's just kind of the same guy as before, but we stuck a bunch of demon bits onto him. I don't know, I get that I kind of rambled on this point, but my overall view on Evil Sanctus is, it's okay, but I think it could have been done better. With that, I'd still say Sanctus is like a high B, low A overall. Agnus is named after the Agnus Dei. In the Catholic Ordinary of the Mass, it's a prayer denoting Jesus as the Lamb of God, a prayer blessing Jesus for being the Lamb of God and taking on the sins of the world. This links in with Agnus feeling sort of the same way about Sanctus. Humans are too weak to take responsibility for their own sins, so they need Sanctus to be the shepherd and lead them. It's definitely the strongest link out of the Ordinaries, which is neat considering that Agnus is definitely the strongest design of the three. As a human, he's portrayed as this snivelling, hunched coward, affected by a perpetual stutter, effectively the picture of the stereotypical evil scientist madman. There are some cool edges to it though. The little hanging bang and monocle make his design feel off balance and lopsided, working nicely towards that twisted mad scientist angle. The monocle also lends him this air of superiority and aristocratic pride as he looks down on ordinary people. The real cooking, though, definitely starts with his demon form. It's by far the most unique, angelic demon we get in the game, and it's a perfect representation of his character. The idea to take elements of locusts and flies, two creatures intimately linked with demonic power, and pervert a holy form with them is just cool as a structural base. The whole story is about perversion of religious power to accommodate truly despicable individuals, and this is a far better visualization of that idea than Sanctus. I think the devil here is definitely in the details though. Small things like the asymmetry being carried across from demon to human with the glowing red eye, bringing this running feeling of a lack of balance within Sanctus as a character, a lack of completion. He sees himself as the perfect being, but something is clearly missing. There's more repetition of this idea visible in the Halo, which isn't quite complete. He's also incapable of fighting with his own power despite being a quote-unquote perfect being, and he must opt to throw his creations at you and drain your power for his own, which fits in beautifully with the whole fly and locust thing. The choice of the locust being especially significant, Agnus is definitely the most fun of the main three villains. It's his story which is best tied in with the overall theme of the game. Those who claim to be religious and divine, hiding behind that as a mask to conceal their true depraved nature, as well as what makes a truly strong and good person being their heart, something Agnus, despite his voracious desire for knowledge, could never truly understand. He's also just the most fun villain. The voice actor definitely went ungodly hard on some of those line deliveries. Although I think it's definitely possible to argue that the human design goes a little too far on making him a stereotypical snivelling, cowardly scientist. The use of the stutter would feel a little cheap if it weren't for the fact it's actually a really nice reference to his true form, as it parallels the chittering of an insect. A tier, unquestionably. Also named after a part of the Catholic Ordinary of the Mass, there's Credo. Long story short, the Credo is an affirmation of absolute faith in the one true Christian God and all his power. It links with Credo's absolute faith in Sanctus, a character trait he is ultimately defined by. As a human, he very much plays the part of an uptight, knightly right hand. The sharp angles and closed nature of his coat, the buckles, the sharp hawk-like angles of his face, and the pristine white uniform give the impression of a reserved, severe, and ultimately simple character, whose loyalty to Sanctus is unquestionable. However, there are a few interesting cracks presented in this character design. The relative lack of gold compared to Sanctus and Agnus indicates much less of a sense of arrogance about this character, and the white of the coat is broken up by a stripe of blue and red belt, indicating there's more to him than meets the eye, and bringing him visually a little bit closer to Nero. Additionally, his human design is a really solid contrast to Nero. Sword by the waist as opposed to over the shoulder, white and gold versus red and black, hawk-like sharp features versus Nero's much softer face. Nero's revving engine sword represents his burning fire and passion, where Credo has a very similar looking sword which is just ornamented and lacks any form of revving mechanism, implying that he lacks the same heart and passion. In demon form, the white of his coat parts to reveal the dark purple hiding underneath, visual shorthand for the demonic corruption spreading through his body and soul, with scaly demonic flesh overtaking angelic white feathers. His design introduces this inherent lack of balance in the supposedly divine forms of the Order members. The two halves of his halo don't link, and are actually uneven sizes. His body is also literally split in two between his humanoid upper half and his demonic legs, featuring what looks like a cross between bird talons and a goat's cloven hooves. A really nice use of the running idea of animal chimerism to communicate the true demonic nature of this form hiding behind the divine facade. It fits that Credo is the design that most consistently displays this aspect as well. He's torn between two worlds as his loyalty to the Order and love for his sister both pull him in fundamentally different directions as a character. He's caught between wanting to be the shield of the people, protecting those like his sister who have no means to protect themselves, as well as being the Order's sword and eradicating its enemies, which I bet readily influenced the choice of his weapons, a really cool detail. Once again, I love it when weapon choice is used like this. Despite the demonic corruption, the design keeps this honourable knightly demeanour about him, in great part due to the inclusion of the singular wing being used as a sort of matador cape covering his arm as he attacks. He's clearly meant to be somewhat of a foil for Nero, which he's okay at. I mean, he does discover his humanity through the fear of losing someone close to him, much like Nero discovering his own sense of responsibility, but this arc is undercut by a severe lack of screen time and focus on Credo. His sacrifice feels melodramatic and lacking in weight because we have no reason to care about him or his story, and there's no real dramatic tension when you fight him either, because you've known him for a grand total of 5 minutes. There's clearly a lot of setup for a good character here, though. I think he was just a victim of the DMC4 crunch. A tier. Gloria. What a strange character. Played as this unravelling traitor with uncertain loyalties in the Order's midst for the first half of the story, and then completely abandoned in a cheap reveal in the next. You really hate to see it, especially considering when she could have been such a cool character in her own right, given proper time. Or the whole Trish reveal could have been made much less As it stands, at base she's a pretty cool design, built firmly on good old-fashioned fun fan service, complete with boobs hanging to the wind, and an insistence on strutting like she's got scoliosis. Her fighting style is pretty cool too. It's rare that we get to see someone using smaller arms like knives in Devilmaycry, so her choreography is actually really unique and cool, and has one of the most underrated scenes in the game, probably because she's never relevant again. But, say, wasn't there another female character in Devilmaycry with dark skin who used knives, whose primary colours were red, white and grey, and who's also linked with birds, and whose devil trigger has her sprout wings from her back, who also, much like Lady, has a vested interest in stopping regular humans driven mad by demonic power, and also, like Lady, was snubbed from having any plot relevance, or even appearing. That's right, baby, I'm gonna make my bet here right now, right here. I am sure that in the original draft, Gloria was supposed to be Lucia, a character series writer Bingo Morihashi has often tried to reintroduce to the series with little success. I hate to say it, but we were almost so back Lucia heads, all 5 of you. I think this plot point could have worked so much better as well, given Lucia's established history of using disguises and espionage. Yes, I know it's very poorly established, but shut up, I'm cooking. And it could have avoided the Trish reveal's fate of feeling effortless at best and downright strange at worst. Overall, though, it's a C. It's a nice and flashy design by all accounts, but it lacks significant character or thematic meat on its bones, considering Gloria is a complete non-entity. Speaking of Trish, she did get somewhat of a glow-up, though she barely appears in the main game, so it isn't really put to good use. I think DMC4 updates her design quite nicely, retaining most of the elements that made it iconic, while adding neat character touches like having the lightning-shaped split in her dress be connected by a layer of thin material, implying that the events of Devilmaycry 1 have somewhat healed the split present in her Devilmaycry 1 incarnation. Other than this, she's more of a cool piece of DMC set dressing in this game, though I do love that they actually incorporated her lightning abilities into her moveset. C tier. Lady, similarly, is more of a piece of cool DMC flavoured set dressing than a character here, which is really a shame because unlike Trish, she was previously a really complex and interesting character who by all rights should have had some sort of tie into this game's core ideas, given that she's the resident human of the Devilmaycry posse. She's obviously changed a lot and become more mature since the days of DMC3, and her attitude to demons should definitely be a little toned down and lighthearted in comparison to before, but here she basically isn't a character, which is such a shame to see after seeing how post-DMC3 Lady could be done insanely well in the DMC series, and I'm afraid this kind of mischaracterization of Lady is gonna last. Her design in this game, unlike Trish, actually does change a fair amount about the character. For a start, she no longer has that vibrant colour contrast between white shirt, black skirt, and red boots, which both added important visual contrast to the design and worked towards her storytelling. Now she just has a white skirt and yellowish brown boots. No storytelling is being done here, other than sanding the character down, plus losing that fun walking arsenal aspect from her design by removing a lot of the gun cartridges and grenades from around her belt, as well as the knives and the big guns, and so she's just a big booby lady with shades and Kalina Ann, which is fine as is. It's just such a tremendous downgrade from what she was before, much like her usage within the story. D tier.
So, before we get on to the Devilmaycry 4 enemy designs proper, we have a couple to go over, which are basically just kind of recycled Devilmaycry 1 designs, which are done to differing levels of interesting. First we have, oh look, I can't believe it's not Devilmaycry 1's marionettes. I'm not sure whether or not this is just a translation error, but these are clearly just Devilmaycry 1's marionettes, but again. However, of the DMC1 return enemies, they do have the most actually done with them in their lore. Firstly, they're named after another empty tool used by humans. Scarecrows are ultimately just hollow imitations of a human whose purpose is to threaten and imitate, but crucially, they have no heart. Just like the whole theme of the story. I like all the different variants with blades stuck every which way, even if it literally doesn't fucking matter in gameplay outside of the big boy. It gives an idea of these guys as shambling vessels formed out of whatever scrap was lying around at the time. I absolutely love the new lore about them being sacks possessed by evil demon beetles. It fits the theme of these enemies really nicely, as well as being a neat visual touch when they break apart into them. I think this is just a very nice case of DMC4 taking a classic enemy design and reinterpreting it with a big touch of that post-DMC3 wackiness, which I really like. It keeps the kind of gothic horror of DMC1, but adds a load of wackiness, which is really, really fun. I haven't got that much to say about them. I think they're just a really solid A-tier design overall. The return of the Frosts, however, I'm very much on. They took an enemy from Devilmaycry 1 with a lot of style and intrigue and basically did nothing with it. I'm not against bringing enemies back from older games, but I prefer it generally if something interesting is done with a visual update for them. It isn't like the Scarecrow where it's this really fun reinterpretation of what the enemy design could be within the themes of the series. It's just kind of a very blatant reach because of the crunch, so they settled for having Ice Demon that we already have established in Ice Place. Even though Frost lore is that it's one of Mundus's most elite soldiers, so it makes no sense for it to be positioned towards the start of the game. But anyway, the new design is very much just a kind of HD remaster of the old design with a big ice shield added, which adds decently interesting continuity with the blades, but other than that, The original Frost design got away with being very simple because DMC1 had very severe graphical limitations, so the angular icicle-ridged form cutting that imposing-ass silhouette on the rooftop in Mission 17 was all it really needed to do. But here there was an opportunity to improve, to maybe add some of that running demon chimerism by adding different aspects of different animals, maybe like a cool biological suit, or just adding some demons are truly weak and fragile beneath a facade of strength theming, with like a frosty heart core that was obviously visible. Just anything really to variate it from what's gone before. It is a C-tier design, it's still cool, but mostly piggybacking off of what worked in 1 rather than doing anything actively unique. My problems with the Frosts go equally for the quote-unquote assaults, which are literally just blades, but sometimes they give them a regular lizard head. Again, I don't have that much to say here I didn't say about them in DMC1. They're an excellent design because they're these horrid mutated lizard abominations forced to become more warlike by the demons that possess them, but the fact that they still have to protect themselves with objects mimicking human armor reveals their true weakness. Here it's pretty much the same deal, except DMC4 lacks a lot of the atmosphere of the first game, so most of the gothic charm they had there is lost. And because of the lack of visual clarity DMC4 often experiences, you don't get that same sense of constantly knowing what these things are. More often than not, I could barely see any details in the design when I was fighting them. They do get some more ornamentation on the headgear, including some feathers and stuff, which, yeah, that's some nice extra detail, but it doesn't really do all that much. They're also literally just porting the design across while doing nothing to make it more interesting or tie it into the themes of DMC4 as a game. Though, don't get me wrong, it is definitely appropriate for 4 to reference 1 as perhaps the game that is thematically closest to it, but I much prefer it if that takes the form of actual interesting reinterpretations of existing concepts, instead of, yeah, here's Blades again, but HD. Plus, the name Assault sucks. At least to me, it loses a lot of the simple characterization and menace you get from Blade. I do find it funny that in these 3 designs, you can see 3 completely separate attitudes to reintroducing designs from older games, and you could tell the attitude by the name. You have Scarecrows, which actually take an OG enemy, show respect for it, and do something cool with the themes that it expresses. Then you've got the Frosts, which are pretty much just a carbon copy of their previous incarnation, but lose a lot of what made them work originally because nothing's been done with them. And then you've got the Assaults, which introduced very surface level minor changes to the design and changed the name to kind of feign doing something different with them, but the changes just kind of end up being meaningless. C tier overall. I have complicated feelings on the Blitz, to say the least. In terms of fighting, I truly believe it is one of the worst designed enemies in the series, and fundamentally clashes with everything this game is supposed to make you feel, in an incredibly uninteractive manner. However, this design is also very in keeping with themes of demonic power, and how it's been portrayed over the course of the series, and how beings consumed by demonic power always must have ways of avoiding retaliation by Dante because they fear him. Honestly, I do think my enemy and boss design analysis in these videos has been a little too weighted by how the enemy feels to play against, rather than how the decisions within that gameplay design interact with the themes of the story, a distinction I feel is pretty relevant, as I already have a planned video talking about how DMC enemies play regardless. Though the enemy design here sucks from a player standpoint, it does actually make perfect sense thematically that one of Mundus's most powerful soldiers is this blind barbarian, effectively, whose power is so great he can't even properly control where it's directed or at who. While I think his visual design is lacking a little in flair and interesting features, it's just a solid design craft for a lightning enemy to be dominated by jagged lines and uneven surfaces. I also like the neat visual contrast between bone armor and raw red musculature, but I don't think the way that those parts are arranged is actually communicating anything interesting. The name is at least nicely fitting. This is definitely an enemy that could have benefited from some more chimerism, I think, bringing aspects from animals other than just reptilian features, maybe some cool electric eel stuff. Overall, though, it's still a B tier, much as I hate to say it. On to Agnus's demonic creations, which are much more visually interesting, even if they lack the gameplay chops to back it up. The Gladius are demons created by magically crossbreeding a reptile and a sword. No, I'm not fucking kidding, that's what they went with. The idea here, similar to Mundus's creations, is that these beings are fundamentally flawed, but despite the arrogance of the one that created them, which is expressed in the Gladius through the fact that they can literally only do one thing. I like their alternate forms as flying sword lizards, that's pretty cool. They're definitely the best executed of the weapon demons, though considering one of their forms is literally just a sword, they are a little undercooked. The Cutlass expresses similar ideas to the Gladius, again fusing a sword with an animal. This time it's a fish. The choice of name doesn't really have that much to do with the design here, I guess Cutlass because pirates use cutlasses and this is a fish and fish live in the sea and pirates, I don't know. I do love the concept of a land shark enemy though, and this executes on that fairly interestingly. I guess one of my main problems with these designs is that they don't really feel artificially created. Like, the Gladius gets away with it a bit because it actually transforms into a giant floating sword and has a mechanism to it, but not much about the Cutlass feels mechanical. Refer to DMC1's Nightmare for an example of this actually done kind of well. C tier. It's a cool base concept, lacking in a lot of interesting execution for me. Basilisks are, on the face of it, pretty cool looking. I love the skull head wreathed in flame, with the rest of the body being winding pieces of metallic sinew, which gives the design this really cool gothic horror edge I feel like a lot of the other demon designs in this game lack. The base concept here is a dog that's been fused with a gun, and I think that's actually expressed neatly in certain things like the head blasting off and regenerating whenever the dog shoots. Even though I just wish there was more of an element of the mechanical here again. I think that would really take this base cool demonic hellhound design to the next level. In terms of the name, it's obviously referencing the mythical creature the Basilisk, but the wiki also drew this interesting connection I had no idea about to the Basilisk canon, which was a gigantic Middle Ages canon so powerful that it was thought the sight of it alone would kill you. B tier. I like this design. The Chimera might be once again one of my most hated enemies, but it does have a really cool design. So they're made of this mass of hair-like tendrils, which makes the body of the demon look bulkier than it actually is, belying a paper-thin body and stringy limbs below. I love how the parasite is a bud which flowers once it attaches to a host. The lore of the Chimera is that they latch onto stronger demons in order to control them, and hijack their body. There we go. Demonic power is parasitic and it requires possession of something else to express its power. Demons also lack heart and are completely okay with parasitizing their own if it means survival and greater power for themselves. But that greater power just amounts to a desperate attempt to keep enemies away with their bladed tendrils. Thematically a really cool enemy. I wish more was done with them in terms of enemies they could parasitize. I would especially love for you to see a version you have to deal with that's attached to a human. Chimera is an apt name here. It refers to the multi-headed monster of Greek myth, which other demons have taken lighter inspiration from, and also the concept within genetics known as chimerism, which refers to an organism that is comprised of two genetically different types of cell. The effective meaning here is that demonic power has no true singular form or purpose, because it lacks heart. The Chimera in Greek mythology is also the spawn of Echidna, which is a cool tie-in with the fact that these are spawned by the boss Echidna. Mephisto and Faust mark the mandatory squishy enemy hiding behind a cloak to prevent damage that you have to shoot away enemy. But they do mark a significant improvement from the sins in that they actually have a weakened state that you can see their true pathetic form in. The Mephisto is a pretty strong design. The claws of the true insectoid body are posed into lazily positioned arms that barely move, and attack only by extending their fingers into long spears, as if they're trying to project this idea that it's not worth physical exertion trying to attack you because they're so strong, which is a deliberate illusion to hide the fact that it's all a facade. The back end of the true body forms this steep crown, which is a nice detail too, communicating a lot of arrogance and superiority from this demon shrimp. There's also a lot of strong use of contrasting colours and shape language to draw your eyes to the main body, and give you a sense that not everything is as it seems with this fella. Faust, meanwhile, is just an insanely cool design, even at a surface level. I love the fact that the shadowy cloak is drawn up to give him a hat, and the additional coverage of the body in addition to have two whole hands of spear-like fingers rather than one to communicate this superiority over the Mephisto. I love how both use their demonic power in an attempt to look human, despite their true insectoid form, which is interesting considering their apparent demonic disdain for humanity. Once again, it's just using the core established design concepts of these types of Devil May Cry enemies really nicely, and actually evolving them in an interesting direction by adding more actual interactivity with the cloaks. The names reference Mephistopheles and Faust. Mephisto means the one that fears the light, an apt name for a demon which fears having itself revealed, though Faust is entirely because it links in with Mephisto, and I think they just thought it sounded cool. A tier for both. The Bianco and Alto Angelo are artificial demons, crafted by bonding demonic and human souls to suits of armor, which is a really cool concept. Bianco means white. Alto is a musical term meaning high, so their names translate to White Angel and High Angel respectively. Once again, demonic power is fundamentally a hollow shell, an image with nothing backing it up. So fittingly, these are hollow suits of armor. They twist and pervert an object that's meant to protect people by removing the perceived weakness of human flesh. I also think the elements used to communicate the demonic truth hiding behind the angelic facade work really nicely. You've got Bianco Angelo's horns and the darkened bluish wings on its shield, as well as Alto Angelo's incomplete halo. The dark gaps in the armor add this strong visual contrast and create this feeling of something lurking just underneath. I think these designs are really strong. I could definitely see them going a lot harder though. I don't have any particular counter ideas, but I'd love to see a bit more subtle demonic darkness hiding behind the facade, like Mundus's corrupted heart. Preferably something biological too, like the armor itself is made out of flesh beneath the facade. Demons aren't able to escape their nature as flesh and blood beings, no matter how much they'd like to pretend otherwise. Despite that minor quibbling, banger design. S tier. As much as I'd love to pretend the Faust don't exist, they do, so I've got to rank them. They are actually a pretty interesting design. A humanoid head which opens up like a flower to consume you is always going to be cool, and the fact that it burrows into the ground keeps that other demons won't face Dante head-on vibe. It reminds me a lot actually of a Rafflesia, or the corpse flower, which keeps in really nicely with the whole jungle theme of the area they're in. I wish they actually went a little bit harder on the plant theme actually, and maybe fit in a bit more with the aesthetics of the area they're from. Instead they feel, both in terms of colour palette and in terms of design, quite a bit out of place. This design definitely could have been built on in a really cool way and maybe even linked in with the Chimeras. C tier. Berial is, on one level, a really competent design. He uses Devilmaycry's running chimerism to full advantage, effectively being a mishmash of completely disparate animal pieces like bull horns with a lion's head, all bound in the obvious visual shape of a centaur, one of the best known chimeras. You've got dark, stony skin contrasted with flaming molten accents, and that giant greatsword definitely makes it an eye-catching design. It's a neat contrast with the Angelos actually, a demon with angelic wings of flame. Once again, more evidence of how the demons abuse this iconography. The flames he's constantly wreathed in are actually supposed to protect him from magical attacks, ironic considering he claims to be an honourable fighter. Story-wise, he's an okay stepping stone. The only interesting thing about him is how he acts all macho and then retreats from every fight he's a part of. Demonic cowardice at its finest. He's a good, clean design, but this is also kind of the problem. It's too clean for me. It's lacking big in the personality department, small pieces of detail and imperfections that tell me more about the actual character of Berial. Without those, it just feels sort of flat. He's supposed to be a demon who rose up from the bottom to become the conqueror of the fire hell. But nothing about this design really communicates any of that to me. He could have definitely used with some third element like ornamentation on his sword or some sort of armor to demonstrate his nature as a conquering ruler rather than just generic fire demon number 5467. Additionally, nothing here really communicates the themes of the game at all, about the heartlessness of demons and how separating yourself from emotion leads to power becoming purposeless. Again, another good use for armor in this design. That said, it is still perfectly functional, and fine at doing what it wants to do, despite being disparate from the game, its themes, and even the area it inhabits. B tier overall. Bael and Dagon are really cool anglerfish/toad hybrids, which is a neat chimera off the bat. Its feelers are siren-like fairies that lure humans into the creature's gullet. This is unironically a really cool concept. You can imagine these things existing as part of real in-world folklore. Thematically, it fits. Demons abuse the human emotion of love to lure in its prey. It's really cool that the names for the two separate fights of these creatures, Bael and Dagon, are a fish god and a frog demon respectively, the two halves of this design. But it goes even deeper than that. Bael was a demon who was believed to grant the power of invisibility to its followers. Just like in-game, Bael can turn invisible in order to force you to fight its feelers. Meanwhile, Dagon, in addition to being a god of the sea, was a god of fertility, and both Bael and Dagon use their feelers in an attempt to lure people in with sex effectively. I do love just a really well-chosen pair of names that feel like they were core to the design process with these two. Just having that little link does persuade me to let it out of palette swap jail. However, the ice theme does feel a little forced, especially on Dagon. The lures work fine as these dancing points of light in the midst of a snowstorm, but Bael and Dagon themselves just don't really feel like ice demons whatsoever in terms of their physicality. You can tell the designers realized this because they just sort of crammed a load of icy spines on wherever there was room, which just kind of break the whole design up for me, and don't even really work at their intended purpose, other than drawing more attention to the problem. He desperately needed some actual ice-themed attacks or abilities, or even some fur which would both give him an actual wintry feel and add to the chimerism. An A tier overall though. Echidna, named for the ancient Greek monster Echidna, the mother of monsters. She was also described as being a giant half-woman, half-viper hybrid, which seems to have heavily inspired a lot of her look in-game. The original form we see her in is this giant emerald serpent, the jaw of which splits apart into four and reveals the body of a woman inside. Cool chimerism and neat reinterpretation of the myth to start, but DMC4 goes harder here. This is the first of the main beast designs that actually takes interesting inspiration from its environment. You fight Echidna in a jungle, so a lot of her design becomes more heavily themed around plants. The jaws of the serpent split apart to form petals, her main body is the stigma, and her hair is actually an accumulation of vine-like tendrils. I really wish this linking in of the bosses with these environments that have supposedly been twisted by their demonic energies was more common. Echidna's also interesting on a thematic level too. DMC4 is supposed to be kind of a reaffirmation of the ideas that DMC1 introduced thematically, and while we see plenty of evidence of the power of the human heart, we don't see any of one of 1's most interesting aspects, demons that still display human positive traits. Echidna is that. Sort of. Echidna in mythology is inherently a maternal figure, obviously, because she's the mother of monsters. The idea of a maternal figure is thematically interlinked with the idea of unconditional love, the one thing demons can never truly hope to grasp about humanity. However, her unconditional love comes in the form of a possessive desire to overrun everything with her parasitic progeny, so she can effectively become the mother of everything. Accordingly, rather than being some sort of bait or trick, Echidna's true body and weakest point in your boss fights with her is her human body, which lies underneath what is effectively this false demonic facade. It's a really cool reversal of the design principles of the series thus far, and again, I wish there was more of this. DMC4 seems to almost try and answer DMC1 here in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, the overt storytelling backing up this insanely good design doesn't really do it justice. It takes this really interesting story of perverted maternal love that manifests as this toxic desire to spread life everywhere regardless of what anything else thinks. Doesn't really get all that much done with it. She doesn't really get much time to shine, and the time that she does get reveals very little about her character, because it's much more focused on either making Nero or Dante look cool, which is fine. It is the aim of the game after all, but DMC3 was able to walk this tightrope so much better in terms of characterizing its demons within a very short time span. S tier though, regardless. I feel like my biggest criticism of the Saviour is present in the fact that I have literally nothing at all to say about him. For a giant Jesus mech created by an insane demon pope to commit a false flag operation on demonkind, this is really quite visually tame. I think a lot of the problems this design has stem from the fact that it's inherently competing against Mundus, and should be an answer to it in some ways. Mundus was a demon pretending to be a god. The Saviour is a human pretending to be a god. Where would the similarities and differences between these two lie? Unfortunately, the Saviour just does the bare minimum there. Like, there's nothing I can really say about this I haven't said about either Mundus or Sanctus, and both of those designs handle the whole demonic hiding behind the facade of holiness thing a lot better. The Saviour just uses a lot of Sanctus' symbology, like the broken halo forming sort of horn, and makes some references to Mundus, like the gem set on the forehead representing Mundus' third eye. What's annoying is that when we see the interior of the Saviour with Nero, it's actually made out of constantly pulsating flesh and darting eyes. It's so annoying that this isn't incorporated into the design at all. Like, why couldn't the big glowy Resident Evil hit spots break to reveal undulating demonic tissue? Or even something as simple as having some of the demonic souls used to create this thing leak out, or anything. As it is, if you showed me this out of context, I would have no idea this thing is supposed to work for the bad guys, which I guess is lore accurate for its purpose in deceiving the masses, but there's nothing interesting working in the background to subvert this design either. The version with Sanctus's face overriding Sparda's as his ego finally takes over the Saviour is admittedly much better. I just wish it wasn't so short-lived, and again showed more of the demonic elements coming through. So much of the concept art for the Saviour is absolutely sick though, like this one with actual cracks of demonic energy showing through it, or the one where the Saviour actually has a female physical form. Just a C tier, I think, overall. Not much really being done here. Okay, so to conclude, Devilmaycry 4 designs, much like the game they're from, are a real mixed bag for me. You can absolutely feel the time crunch in some of these, while there are some genuine standouts lurking here and there. I feel like at its best, this game is a really cool thematic improvement on, and an answer to Devilmaycry 1, expanding its core ideas in natural ways with inventive redesigns of its enemies. At other times, though, its designs just feel severely undercooked for one reason or another, keeping a lot of the traditions of the series is stuck to intact, while not really doing anything of note by itself, and sometimes not even really doing that well. Definitely, it could be a lot worse, but it could be significantly improved by a remaster, Capcom, hint hint, nudge nudge. Anyway, that was kind of my complete thoughts on the designs for this game. I didn't have as much to say here because I don't feel that there was as much thematic depth across the board as there has been with other games like DMC3 or DMC1. However, it was still interesting to have a look at these. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.